The war can only be continued if we take out of this country what we need. Many millions of people will be starved to death. Those words didn't come from some fringe extremist scribbling in a prison cell. They came from Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, coldly summarizing official German policy toward the Soviet Union. And what came next would become the most destructive military campaign in the history of human civilization. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million troops, 4/5 of Germany's entire military, committed to a single, all-or-nothing gamble that would either deliver Hitler the world or consume his empire entirely. But this wasn't just about winning a war. What Hitler was really building, what Barbarossa was designed to make possible, was something so monstrous in its scale that most people still don't fully grasp it today. And the consequences of what happened on those blood-soaked plains didn't end in 1945. They shaped the next 5 decades of global politics, brought the world to the edge of nuclear annihilation more than once, and created a geopolitical fault line we're still living with right now. To understand why Hitler felt compelled to make this gamble, you have to understand what he was actually trying to build. Not just a powerful Germany, not just dominance over Europe. Hitler and Heinrich Himmler were already deep into the planning of something called the Grossraum, a concept so extreme it makes ordinary conquest look modest by comparison. The Grossraum was envisioned as a gigantic Germanic superstate stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way east to the Ural Mountains, every inch of it ruled by what the Nazis called the master race. The more acceptable peoples within its borders would be kept alive as servants. The rest, the Slavs, the Jews, anyone deemed too decadent to survive, would be eliminated. Systematically, completely. Hitler himself put it plainly, what will take the place of nationalism in the world will be a universal society of masters and slaves. He wasn't speaking in metaphor. He meant it literally. And the only thing standing between Hitler and the realization of this vision was the Red Army of the Soviet Union. The problem was, the Red Army he was about to face wasn't the force it should have been, because in one of the most staggering acts of self-destruction in military history, Joseph Stalin had spent the previous years methodically gutting his own armed forces. In 1936, Marshal Tukhachevsky, the chief of staff of the Russian army, one of the most capable military minds in the Soviet Union, was arrested, tried in a single day, and executed for treason. It was the beginning of a purge, so sweeping it's almost hard to believe. By the time Stalin was done, 3 of the 5 remaining marshals of the Soviet Union were dead. All 11 deputy ministers of defense gone. 75 of the 80 members of the military Soviet eliminated. Every single commander of every military district removed. 13 of 15 army commanders shot. And roughly 30% of all officers below brigade level purged, imprisoned, or killed. The men who replaced them were often inexperienced, terrified, and selected more for their political loyalty than their military ability. Meanwhile, across the border, Hitler was doing the exact opposite. He was pouring resources into building the most technologically advanced and tactically innovative fighting force the world had ever seen. The contrast couldn't have been more brutal, and it wasn't just the military Stalin was destroying. The entire Soviet Union had become a machine of fear. Between 1930 and 1932, 5 million peasants who resisted collective farming were exiled or thrown into labor camps. Catholic priests, Orthodox clergy, Ukrainian nationalists, industrial workers, all swept up in the terror. The justice system had become a dark joke. A man was sentenced to death for borrowing a horse and a boat from a collective farm without permission. Another was executed for throwing a stone at a piglet. The Soviet Union, which had promised its people a brave new world, had delivered them a nightmare. As one despairing citizen put it, "We all have ropes around our necks. I used to know what communism was. Now who could know?" And through all of this, the Russian people were kept completely in the dark. Stalin had banned any criticism of Germany from the press. The buildup happening right on their border, the hundreds of thousands of German troops, the tanks, the artillery, none of it was being reported. They had no idea what was coming. But before Hitler could turn east, he had unfinished business in the West. And the way he handled it tells you everything about how he operated. Starting in 1936, Hitler began his territorial expansion with a series of moves so bold they bordered on reckless. He marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, directly violating the Versailles Treaty. His soldiers carried sealed orders to retreat at the first sign of French resistance. That resistance never came. Emboldened, he annexed Austria in 1938. Then he took the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, with Britain's Prime Minister Chamberlain declaring Hitler was a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. 6 months later, German armies occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, and still, no serious response from the Western powers. Each time Hitler gambled and won, his confidence grew and his ambitions expanded. France and Britain's policy of appeasement wasn't keeping the peace. It was feeding the monster. Then came the move that shocked the world. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, two ideological enemies who had spent years denouncing each other, announced a non-aggression pact. Fascism and communism shaking hands. Behind the public agreement was a secret protocol carving up Eastern Europe between them like a dinner menu. Hitler got the green light he needed. On September 1st, 1939, 50 German divisions crashed into Poland. 9 divisions of heavy armor, overwhelming air superiority, and a fighting force the Polish military simply couldn't withstand. Within weeks, Poland was crushed between German forces from the west and Soviet armies from the east. The two powers met at Brest-Litovsk, the same city where peace had been signed between them in 1918, and quietly divided their spoils. Stalin used his new breathing room aggressively. He strong-armed the Baltic states into accepting Soviet military bases, then absorbed them entirely through rigged elections. He seized eastern Poland. Then he turned toward Finland, demanding the Karelian Peninsula. When Finland refused, the Red Army invaded. What followed was an embarrassment that reverberated across the entire world. No military intelligence assessment had been conducted. Russian soldiers were sent into -50-degree temperatures in inadequate clothing, with felt boots that disintegrated in wet snow, thin coats, and padded uniforms that were already rotting. The first Soviet assault on Finland's Mannerheim defensive line was a catastrophic failure. Finnish ski units ran circles around snowbound Soviet formations, inflicting casualties at a ratio that seemed almost impossible. Nikita Khrushchev, who would later lead the Soviet Union himself, estimated Russian losses close to 1 million men against Finland, a country a fraction of Russia's size. For anyone paying attention, it was a screaming advertisement for just how badly Stalin had damaged his own military, and Hitler was paying very close attention. By the time France fell in June 1940, crushed in just 6 weeks, the world left speechless. Hitler's strategic calculus had shifted completely. Stalin had been hoping for a long, grinding war between Germany and the Western Allies that would exhaust both sides. Instead, France was gone, Britain was isolated, blockaded, and being bombed into submission. The Western conflict had stalled. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed the first Barbarossa Directive. The USSR, it stated, might be invaded even before the war with Britain was over. The decision was made. What warnings Stalin received, and he received many, from British intelligence, American intelligence, and his own spy networks, he ignored with almost delusional stubbornness. His subordinates, terrified of his reaction, began withholding crucial intelligence rather than risk his fury. Stalin continued increasing grain shipments to Germany, withdrew recognition from governments in exile, and banned any newspaper from printing a single critical word about the Nazi regime. He believed he was buying time. He was walking toward a cliff. By May 1941, the Red Army's condition was staggering in its unreadiness. 170 Soviet divisions were stationed in newly occupied territory, more than half of them in positions where fortifications and communications were still incomplete. Many formations were between 6,000 and 7,000 men short of wartime strength. Only one of 6 mechanized corps had received its full complement of equipment. 3 of 4 motorized divisions had no tanks at all. 4 out of every 5 vehicles in the tank fleets were obsolete. In the Air Force, 2 of every 3 aircraft were outdated models. Only 1 in 5 crews could fly under instrument conditions, even during daylight. Communications relied primarily on civilian telephone lines. Just 1 in 4 units that should have had radios actually did. The major offensive plan for each army wasn't due until July 1st. Their defensive strategies weren't scheduled for completion until November, and facing them across the border was the most formidable fighting force ever assembled. 3 German army groups, 148 fully manned, fully equipped divisions, 19 panzer divisions and 15 panzer grenadier divisions, sharpened by 2 years of victorious warfare. Army Group South under Field Marshal von Rundstedt targeting Kiev and the Ukraine. Army Group Center under von Bock driving toward Smolensk and ultimately Moscow. Army Group North under von Lieb slicing through the Baltics toward Leningrad, supplemented by 500,000 Finnish troops and 150,000 Romanians, 3,350 tanks, over 7,000 artillery pieces, 625,000 horses, and 2,770 aircraft, representing 80% of the Luftwaffe's entire operational strength. Only the night before the invasion were Soviet armies even put on a war alert, and even then they were forbidden from responding to any provocation without direct approval from Moscow. At 4 a.m. on June 22, 1941 it began. The German blitzkrieg hit the Soviet line like a wall of steel and fire. In the first hours, the Luftwaffe claimed to have destroyed nearly 1,500 Soviet aircraft on the ground before they could even take off. On the second day, a Russian bomber group commander took his own life after 12 German fighters wiped out 600 of his planes. Without radar, without ground control, often without sufficient fuel, Soviet pilots were reduced to ramming German aircraft with their own, a suicidal tactic that one pilot named Lieutenant Mikhail Zhukov actually survived, going on to become an ace with 9 kills. On the ground, the story was just as devastating. The Panzer divisions sliced through Soviet defenses with a precision that left commanders stunned, creating massive breaches and then curling back to encircle entire Russian armies. The encirclement at Minsk alone yielded 300,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, and 1,400 artillery pieces. 32 of 43 Russian divisions in the area were gutted within a single week. German forces had penetrated 300 kilometers into Soviet territory in days. Stalin, faced with the catastrophe he had refused to prepare for, panicked completely. While his headquarters desperately tried to piece together what was even happening, he ordered immediate counterattacks on all fronts, sending already shattered, disorganized troops to be slaughtered in the open. As the first true reports filtered through, he collapsed. "All that Lenin created," he declared, "we have lost forever." Then he retreated to his country house and disappeared for days. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union through absolute terror had simply checked out at the moment his country needed him most. And into the vacuum stepped, of all people, the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Sergei of Moscow, who broadcast an impassioned appeal to the Russian people, invoking Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, the ancient defenders of the motherland. It was a masterstroke Stalin would later steal for his own propaganda, because while the Russian people might have been lukewarm about dying for the Communist Party, millions of them were willing to die for Russia itself. At the front, the slaughter continued at a scale almost impossible to comprehend. German officers were not even bothering to use code as they broadcast their movements. There was simply no need for secrecy when the enemy was in freefall. Russian troops attempting to obey Stalin's orders to counterattack were being cut down in open fields. Others were being machine-gunned by their own military police for retreating. By July 3rd, less than 2 weeks after the invasion began, General Halder of the German General Staff was writing in his diary that the war against the Soviet Union had essentially been won. But German intelligence had made a catastrophic error in their calculations. They had dramatically underestimated what Russia could mobilize. By July 1st, 5.3 million men had been called up. Stalin emerged from hiding and for once told his people the truth, that a grave danger hung over the country, that this was a matter of life or death. And something shifted in the Russian psyche. Not yet victory, not yet resistance capable of stopping Germany, but the first stirrings of a fury that would ultimately consume the Wehrmacht. The German advance rolled on. Another encirclement near Smolensk trapped 300,000 more troops. In the south, the Kiev pocket produced 600,000 prisoners, the single largest capture in the history of warfare, a record that stands to this day. In the north, Leningrad was being strangled. Its citizens, given no time to prepare, formed militia divisions, students, factory workers, civilians, trained for an average of 16 hours before being thrown at German panzer units. The 1st Division was sent to the front 6 days after being formed. The 2nd, 2 days. The 3rd, the same day it was established. When Marshal Zhukov arrived to take command of Leningrad's defense, he found the city in a state of near collapse, its inhabitants on the edge of panic. He converted anti-aircraft guns into anti-tank weapons. He formed naval infantry brigades. He launched raids and counterattacks with whatever he had. And somehow, against all logic, the city held. But only barely. And only because Hitler made a decision that would prove one of his most consequential mistakes of the entire war. He pulled the panzer divisions away from Leningrad to support the drive on Moscow. Instead of taking the city by force, the Germans would try to starve it. What followed would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in history. By mid-October 1941, Germany controlled all of Western Russia on a line stretching from Leningrad in the north to Rostov on the Black Sea. The Red Army was still retreating. Nearly 50% of Russia's grain-producing lands were in German hands. Villages had been reduced to rubble, livestock slaughtered, industries sabotaged. Thousands of orphaned children wandered the ruins, searching for parents who were never coming back. The rotting carcasses of animals mixed with the corpses of soldiers and civilians across hundreds of miles of devastated countryside. By any conventional measure, the Soviet Union should have been finished. But something the German High Command hadn't fully calculated was the effect their own conduct was having on the Russian will to fight. Reports of the mass execution of prisoners of war, the murder of civilians, the systematic brutality of the German advance, all of it was inflaming a resistance that no military defeat could extinguish. Every village burned, every prisoner shot, every atrocity committed was pouring fuel onto a fire that would eventually burn the Wehrmacht to ash. Operation Barbarossa didn't fail in 1941. Not completely. Not yet. But the conditions for its ultimate failure were already in place. Hitler had gambled that Russia would collapse quickly, that a decapitated, demoralized, purge-weakened army would fold under the first serious blow. He was right about the blow. He was catastrophically wrong about the collapse. What he had actually done was awaken something. A country of nearly 200 million people, with almost unlimited human reserves, factories already moving beyond Luftwaffe range, and a population that had survived Stalin's terror and was now discovering it could survive this too. The war Hitler needed to win in weeks was turning into the war that would ultimately destroy him. And the world that emerged from its ruins, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the Iron Curtain, the decades of superpower standoff, was shaped in those first catastrophic months on the Eastern Front. Every border disputed in Eastern Europe today, every tension between Russia and the West, every ghost of that conflict still rattling around in modern geopolitics, it all traces back to 4 a.m. on June 22nd, 1941, when 3 million men crossed a border and changed everything.